Hey, Pashi is here, and this is a guide for all 10 characters in Dead in Antares, their strengths, their weaknesses, their unique historic traits, and how to most efficiently use these characters. And I will focus mostly on the early to mid game because that's the most important part of the game. Now, let's dive right into it and check out the Captain Amelia. I also have here a sheet. This is the starting stats of her. She's of course available from day one. And all starting stats for all characters always add up to 680. So the total amount does not change, it's just the distribution that changes. And what's quite noticeable for her that she has a lot of average stats. She doesn't have any like 70s or 60s or only 160, and very few skills that have low values. So she can basically do most tasks reasonably well or reasonably bad, however you want to think about it. Now let's take a look at her specifically about to her historic traits. Now these traits, some people call them unique traits or they're called historic traits. Every character has one positive historic trait and one negative. So her positive historic trait is strength in struggle. For every 25 points in a given state, Emilia produces plus 5% items and water yield, has 10% to any state decrease, and receives 10% more XP. So the states are fatigue, hunger, sickness, injury, and stress. And normally for all other characters, you want to keep them down. And first of all, you want to keep them down because once you reach 100, your character dies. But even if you don't reach 100, you get debuffs for certain skills if you have them at certain values. But for Amelia, it's actually the other way around. She kind of likes to have them pretty high. And this trait, if you properly use or abuse it, it's probably the strongest historic trait in the game, I would say. You can somewhat easily get all these values to like 50 or 60, and then you have like 10 stacks of these traits, 10 stacks of this trait, and you would get like 50% more yield, 100% more XP, 100% more stat decrease, so it's very, very strong. Now her historic negative trait, no self-care, any disease, wound, and affliction applied to Amelia lasts for one more day. This is, it's of course a negative trait, and especially in the early game, it's kind of annoying because you only have kind of like one doctor, and he might have other tasks to do. So it's sometimes hard to get rid of diseases or wounds. But especially in the mid to late game, is actually not that big of a deal. And the reason is that some of these affliction or diseases are actually not that bad. You don't really mind them sometimes. If they just increase fatigue, they often don't really matter. And if they do matter and if they are nasty, then you kind of want to heal them anyhow. So usually these affliction, diseases, and wounds, they last for 3 days, and for her they last 4 days. But like I said, if they're really nasty, you want to heal them on the first day anyhow. So I don't. It's a little bit bad in the early game, but it doesn't really matter too much in the mid to late game. Now in terms of battle, she is the only ace class in the game, and the ace classes have the special Chief's Asset passive, which means plus 20% to power surge, which is fairly strong. There are a lot of very powerful power surges. She herself has 7 initiative and 40 health. This is pretty high initiative and pretty average health. Now all other stats here, these are just default stats. Every character has 5 action points and no buffs here, and every character has 15% effect resistance by default, so these are not like special. And the other passives here you see here, you just get them from level up, so we shouldn't talk about them. Now her base class has the base attack pistol shot. That's a pretty strong base attack because it can target both the front row and the back row, which is kind of nice. Now, apart from that, her other skills are a little bit iffy. I think her special Captain Speech buff, which she has from the start, all allies get in the same row, get plus max damage and plus 10 critical alteration, can be strong in certain battles, because in some battles, the enemy buff themselves, and then critical damage is the only damage that really does anything, because criticals ignore damage resistance, so this can be nice. But it's somewhat situational. Often you don't really want to buff, you just want to deal damage to finish off an enemy. Now her other shot, point blank shot, which deals damage to the front row and ignores damage resistance, also situationally solid. The thing is, in in that in Antares, you really want to focus down one enemy at a time, and often the enemy you want to focus down most is often in the back row, because these are healers. You often want to focus down first. So this skill doesn't do anything. But I mean, you have your base attack to deal with enemies in the back row. So having something to ignore damage resistance to a front row enemy is usable. But then this hail of bullets, which just targets all enemies in the front row, I just consider it to be very weak. You don't need to do damage to all enemies in a row. You just want to focus down one enemy at a time. And then once you upgrade the ace class first, you get these two additional skills. One is like kind of like a buff to your own allies, which I don't consider that strong. Swapping row, +1 to initiative is not really impactful. And the other one, it's an efficient way to deal damage to the front row, but it's also very situational, so not sure. And then the other skills, you're more to the mid to late game almost to unlock them, so let's not even talk about them. Now her power surge is pretty weak, to be honest. Blast them all, it deals damage to all enemies in all rows. But again, you don't need to deal damage to all enemies. Instead, you usually rather want to buff yourself or do the other power surges are just way stronger. And it doesn't have high critical, it doesn't ignore damage resistance, it doesn't debuff the enemy, so I don't consider it very strong. But still, this is a very solid class. Her trait is, oh, by the way, in battles, if you have grenades can be quite cheap and quite usable. You might want to give her a grenade such as shield capsule, so she can basically on herself, on ally, give like additional block. And then maybe just kind of maybe even a debuff grenade on her, because she can already target all enemies. So maybe just a grenade that can debuff enemies and remove action points, which can be sometimes useful. But she is somewhat flexible. Critical damage is always useful. She has the best buff in the best historic trait in the game. It's just that her power surge is lacking. Okay, let's go to the next character. The next character is actually William. Now let's talk about William's base stats in the beginning first. He has basically the highest strength, the highest medicine, very high constitution, and very high communication. Now all of these are really, really useful, to be honest. Let's first talk about his traits, and then I talk about why they're useful. Now, first of all, he is a dedicated doctor as a historic trait. When William manages to heal another character's disease, wound, or affliction, they both get -15 fatigue and -12 stress. This is quite useful because his high communication skill makes it easy when talking to people to lower their affliction, to remove their affliction. And of course, his high medicine value makes it so that he can easily heal wounds or diseases. He is the best healer. And -15 fatigue is very strong in the early game when almost all people are often fatigued. And -12 stress is always useful, so it's just a very good trait. Let me then talk about strength and constitution. Both strength and constitution affect some mining parts like carbon and ore, but also both affect the water tank. With strength, you can basically get more yield from the water tank, and with constitution, you can basically have high resistance to fatigue when working at the water tank. And the water tank is probably one of the most important camp stations because you kind of need water every single day. And so he is just the best person to gather water every day. He's also the best healer and almost the best communicator. So it's just like a very strong class. I would consider Amelia to be the strongest character because of her strength in struggles trait, but William is probably the second strongest. Now his negative historic trait is kind of nasty. It says at the beginning of the night, William gets +4 stress for each other character up to 5 with any state over 50. So if any other character has one state over 50, then William gets +4 stress, and this stacks up to 5 times for up to 5 characters. Now the problem here is the negative feedback loop. Like if everything is going well, then this doesn't do anything, right? But if something goes wrong in your campaign and you already have problems, then this is just multiplied via his trait. Now having, for example, just Amelia with high states, so she gets strength in struggle is not a big deal, but it really adds up if multiple people have high states. You can read like Reddit posts or community posts on the forum, and some people will say that he is the first person to die because of this negative feedback loop, and it can be kind of nasty if something goes wrong. Okay, in terms of battle, here's the Vanguard class together with Maria. We talk about Maria later, but he has slower initiative and higher health. Now, the slower initiative is kind of, let's talk about it later, but first, the passive of the Vanguard class is that they get block every turn, especially if they're in the front row. So you kind of want to bring a Vanguard class basically to each battle, because the Vanguard is kind of like the tank in the front row. Now, the base attack I don't consider very strong. It just hits all enemies, which again, you don't need to hit all enemies. But his first skill is already okay-ish. It increases block and deals damage, which is a nice combination. His second skill is this Bulwark is very interesting in the early game. It basically pushes an ally from the front to the back and himself to the front. So it means if this at the start of a battle or after some reshuffling, maybe an ally is exposed in the front, he can switch positions. So it's kind of sad that his initiative is low. Because if his initiative would be higher, he could start the battle and then immediately basically cast Bulwark to protect an ally that is exposed in the front. Because of his low initiative, he can't do it in the early game, in the early parts of the fight. Then Shield Bash is also, I would say, pretty strong. It's just a little bit expensive with 4 action points, but being able to debuff enemies is kind of nice. There are often battles where your backliners target an enemy backliner and basically focus him down, and then William at least can debuff the enemy frontliner and lower their action points, which is kind of impactful. And then once you upgrade the Vanguard class first, you get these 2 skills. I think Guard is kind of nice. It allows you to guard an ally. So if normally the ally would be attacked, the attack is redirected to William, and it gives William 12 blocks, which is a lot. Just a nice combination. Both things are pretty strong, so I kind of like this skill a lot. And then the last skill I don't consider to be that strong. It targets an enemy in the front and moves him to the back and applies a slow. Slow means the enemy needs 1 additional action point to move back to the front. And all of this is kind of nice, but 2 action points for this, I don't know. Often enemies can do something in the back anyhow, so I'm not sure. But his power surge is very, very powerful. His power surge says it targets all allies, him included, and it heals for 4, which is very powerful. It gives 2 block, which is not that impactful, and it purges, which is also situationally powerful. The strong part about healing is that sometimes fights can take a long time and you accumulate a lot of damage. But then once you kill all but 1 enemy, you can basically stall. Just sit there in the front and apply block to yourself, and then every 2 turns or so basically heal everybody up. It's a little bit abusing, but if you abuse it, you basically heal up everybody in your team to full health so you don't get any injury. And then the purge all debuffs aspect is situational, but situationally extremely strong. Some enemies debuff you and even apply poison, and poison is considered to be a debuff as well. And in some of these instances, these poisons would kill you, or these debuffs really hurt you in terms of lowering your damage or lower damage resistance. And in the early to mid game, it's the only way to basically repurge debuffs, so it's just a very small aspect. But overall, this purge is strong, but it's a little bit situational. Sometimes you don't need to purge debuffs, and sometimes you don't care about healing. So if you bring him, you probably want to bring at least 1 other person who has like an offensive power surge, so you're a little bit flexible. In terms of grenades, I like to give him a grenade that can target any enemy, so he can effectively target enemies in the back, which he otherwise wouldn't be able to do to finish them off, maybe with some ignore damage resistance. And then I also like to give him a grenade so he can move enemies to the front, because if you press focus, you have 6 action points total for the next round, and then in the next round you can cast this grenade to move an enemy to the front and debuff him with -3 action points, which can be a nice combination. And again, overall, probably the second strongest character in the game. So let's talk about Leo. So Amelia, Leo, and William are all available from day 1. And Leo is the engineer. He has very high computing for the workshop. He has decently high crafting and physics and even logic. So he will especially work on the workshop a lot. And he also has some interesting unique traits. Let's talk about them. So first of all, let's talk about the negative historic trait, Lone Wolf. While working with a partner, Leo receives plus 20% penalties. Now that's first of all not super impactful. Plus 20% means he gets a little bit more fatigue or maybe a little bit more stress. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but especially in the early game, it doesn't matter at all, because you kind of need to build upgrades first to even have to even be able that several people can work at the same station, and you don't even have enough people in the beginning to work at the multiple stations at once. So overall, it's kind of nice that you get him in the beginning, and his negative trait doesn't really matter in the beginning. And then his positive trait, when material caregiver, when Leo is working at a camp station with a dented or worse condition, it is repaired by 20 instead of being worn down. So this is kind of like normally if somebody works at a station, it's worn down, but I think like by 5 condition. And not only does it not wear down when he works on it, but he also repairs it by 20. So kind of like the delta between him and somebody else working on a dented camp is 25. Now, of course, if a camp station is dented or worse, that means he also gets additional penalties from it. He does get the same yield, but he gets a little bit more fatigue and other penalties. But it's still kind of nice. He wants to work alone anyhow, so he would be the only one affected by these additional penalties. And especially in the beginning, being able to repair workstations for free is just really nice, and it's always a nice trade. So in terms of battle, he is the Sapper class. He has 5 initiative and 36 health, which is kind of like average both, I would say. Maybe a little bit on the lower side in terms of health. And the Sapper class has kind of like interesting flexible support passive. It means that in the back row, he buffs all allies except himself with plus damage. And in the front row, he actually lowers his own damage resistance. Sorry. In the back row, he buffs all allies' damage resistance, but not himself. And in the front row, he lowers his own damage resistance and buffs all allies' damage. That can be nice. Now, normally, you want him to be in the back probably because kind of like your Vanguard, like William, is the only one who wants to be in the front. So this is a little bit situational, the effect of this passive. But it's nice, of course. It's nice. Now his base attack is pretty nice, the base attack of the Sapper class. It deals low damage, but it lowers the enemy's effect resistance. That can be nice in some long fights. You want to debuff enemies at some point, and before you can debuff them, you need to lower their effect resistance, and he can do it quite efficiently. And then once you lowered the enemy effect resistance, you might want to use this skill, Piercing Laser. It also can target any enemy, both backline and front row, which is nice. And it deals decent damage, a little bit expensive for 4 action points, but it both debuffs damage and damage resistance on enemies, which is both nice. And then he can basically shield allies with +5 block. He can't cast it on himself, which is kind of sad, but he can cast it on his allies, which is nice. 5 block. Some allies don't have a good way of giving block to themselves, or maybe an ally's turn was not yet, and so he is the one who can give block to an ally before the ally's turn started. And then the last skill you get from the beginning, Glue Spray, I don't consider it to be that strong. All enemies in a single row get +2 slow and -1 initiative. Again, this +2 slow, I mean, enemies don't really need to move from front to back, and even if they do, this +2 slow, it increases the action points, but overall, I'm not sure. For 3 action points, I'm not sure really how impactful it is. Now, with your first Sapper upgrade, you get this Empowering Wave, which I think is kind of nice. Only buff 1 ally and you only buff minimum and maximum damage, but it also only costs 1 action points. So sometimes you have a Vanguard in the front, doesn't really do damage anyhow, and then you maybe have like 1 ally in the back who has high critical, and then you can just increase his damage very effectively. So it is a nice skill. Situational, but nice. And then the last skill you get with the first upgrade, I'm also not sure. You can move enemies to the front. I guess it is situationally useful. It is situationally useful. Don't need to put a grenade for that because sometimes he himself doesn't care about enemies being in the front, but maybe he wants to do it for an ally. But I'm not sure. Now he has a very nice power surge. It buffs all allies in both, and it gives damage resistance, maximum damage, and critical alteration. All of these are nice. There's kind of like always nice. It's one of those power surges which are always useful. It's defensive, it's aggressive. It's not always the best power surge to use, but it's one that's always useful, which is kind of nice. And then in terms of grenades, I would probably give him like a grenade that ignores damage resistance, because if he wants to finish off an enemy who has damage resistance, his skills don't ignore it, so that's kind of nice. And other than that, the second grenade, I'm not sure. There are many options, maybe even something so a grenade so he can give block himself, which he otherwise can't do efficiently, or maybe just something to buff action points of an ally or something. But he's kind of flexible because he already has some nice skills which are a little flexible. Okay, the next one. Let's talk about Polina. So Polina arrives on day 4. So you get her basically at the evening of day 3. You kind of get her, and then she's available in the morning of day 4. She's kind of like your best scientist with 70 logic, 70 physics, 60 biology, even decent crafting, so she can even work on the workshop. She also has interesting traits, I would say. Now let's take a look. It's kind of interesting. We have to read both. The first, valuable experience. When Polina uses a physical or survival skill, she generates 10 knowledge. Now, basically, it's the kind of skill she's not really good at. Now, survival skills, she's decent at crafting, but all others, she's actually not that good. But let's first talk about her intellectual draw, the negative skill. If Polina did not use any mental or scientific skill during the day, she receives a random affliction during the night. So both of these traits mean she kind of wants to work both, right? She wants to work on the left side and the right side. But the interesting thing is that basically all tasks have both like an aspect what influences the yield and another aspect that influences basically how resistant you are to the fatigue penalties. Let's maybe take a look really quick. So for example, if Polina works on the polymorph station, then she needs high physics to get a high yield. And physics is a scientific skill. So basically, this would, if she does this once a day, intellectual drought is solved. She won't get an affliction. And then basically, the scavenging part for this task is involved to basically show how much resistant she is to fatigue. The higher her scavenging value, the less fatigue she gets, or the less other debuffs she would get if she, for example, gets like does this task differently to get sickness. And scavenging, on the other hand, is a survival skill. And so this skill alone already has like parts of this right side, the mental and scientific skill, and it has part of the left side, so it does generate knowledge also. So this is actually, you just have to be aware of these traits, but these are actually kind of easy to manage most of the time. And the plus 10 knowledge part is really strong. It just adds up over time. You can even give her a task, which I wasn't aware of for the longest time. You could, if you wanted to, give her a task like mining, and then she even gets plus 20 knowledge, because both parts, the aspect that influences the yield and the aspect that influences the resistance, both are basically aspects that increase her knowledge. But then she would be really inefficient doing it, right? But anyhow, knowledge is always useful and it just adds up. You can easily generate 20 knowledge each day with her. Now, in terms of battle class, she is the first civilian class you encounter. She has high initiative and somewhat low health. And civilians have with at least one ally in the same row. She gets plus 1 resistance, plus 10 critical resistance, and plus 10 effect resistance. They are all nice. But if you compare to the Separ class, let's just compare it really quickly. The Separ class, for example, he gives all allies except himself plus 1 damage resistance, and she only gives herself but not other people damage resistance and other resistances. So I guess it's somewhat equivalent, right? It's like just a different, but basically she always has some damage resistance from this passive also. Now her skills are kinda iffy. Her base attack is 3 action points and it only targets the front row. I think for 3 action points, it does do decent damage, but no critical. But you just can't attack the back row, which is just a bad aspect. And then she has Desperate Effort. This can target the back row, but it has several problems. First of all, only targets a random enemy in a single row, and you really want to focus down enemies. So if there are 2 enemies in a row and you want to focus down one of them, then you don't know if you hit the right one, which is super bad. Then she hurts herself with -2 health, which is also bad because if you don't brought like William to the fight and you can't heal yourself afterwards, that's really bad. Then she also gives herself Disarm. Now Disarm means that the next attack that it costs an extra action point, but you lose 1 Disarm stack at the end of each round. So you could basically at least do Desperate Effort once per turn, then at least you're not affected by the Disarm. So it's very situational, but since her base attack can't target the back row, even though I think the skill is not that good, you're actually using it. I use it quite often because there's sometimes just one enemy in the back row and you really want to target him. And it does at least do high damage for low action points. Then the buff is quite useful. She and herself, she buffs herself and an ally with +1 minimum damage and haste. And haste is quite useful. If somebody has haste counters, he can basically move for free. With one haste counter, you can move from the back row to the front row for free. And if you have two haste counters, you could move for free front and back, which can be nice for somebody like the Sapper class. They sometimes want to move to the front because they have a skill that can only be done in the front, the skill, and then move back. And if they have two haste counters, they can basically do the moving for free. So it's kind of nice. It's a little bit, 3 action points, kind of expensive. Then Distraction, I don't think that skill is that strong. It costs 2 action points and only lowers 1 action point from the enemy and 5 critical resistance. She also needs to be in the front where she usually doesn't want to be, so I don't know. This is just a weird skill. And then once she gets her civilian classes get their first upgrade, she gets a very nice skill with hiding for safety. It's situational, but it's basically a better way than defense to end your turn. It does end your turn, so you have to first spend all your action points, but it gives her 8 block, which is a lot for 1 action point. And then gives her 1 damage resistance and -1 maximum damage, and kind of like the +1 damage resistance is nice. The -1 maximum damage is annoying, but you can buff yourself with damage. So overall, I consider this to be situationally, but situationally very strong, and for 1 action point very cheap. So I would often propose to upgrade the civilian class first. It's just nice that they can block themselves with the skill. The other skill is also kind of annoying, Binding Shot. It's again, you have to be in the front, and you still can only target the front, which is still, I mean, I would have expected to have like another skill that can at least target the back, but you can't. It does debuff the enemy, but I'm not sure how useful that really is. Her power surge is very situational. The power surge ignores the effect resistance, so it always lands. And then it swaps all enemies' rows, so enemies from the front go to the back, and from the back go to the front. And then it roots them for 2 turns, so for 2 turns they can't move their row. This is very, very situational. A lot of enemies don't really care whether they're in the back or the front. They can do effective skills from both parts. And you don't lower their action points and you don't deal damage. So even if they maybe can't attack you if they got shuffled, they might still be able to buff themselves, which is almost as annoying often. So this is situational, but I don't consider it to be super strong, but it's situationally it can be strong. If you really, for certain enemies, if you see what their skills are, it can be situationally useful power surge. In terms of grenades, I like to give her like a block grenade shield capsule, so she's able to give block to allies and herself, especially before you have this hiding for safety skill unlocked. And then maybe just a grenade to move enemies to the front, because again, she can only efficiently target enemies in the front, so you might want to be able to move them with this grenade to the front. Okay, the next person. Let's talk about Maria. Maria is available on day 8. She has very high constitution, agility, and decent strength, which is useful for some mining activities. She has very high exploration and decent scavenging, which can be useful, for example, for fruit. And she's even a decent person to fish, because, for example, because of her high perception. Now, especially exploration and stealth make her like a dedicated expeditions person to do all the expeditions. And this aligns well with her traits. She has adventurous spirit. In an expedition, Maria receives +50 skill experience. So first of all, she upgrades here every expedition. You get like exploration and stealth, so she upgrades that faster. And then if she does some curio interaction, like if she is the one that interacts with the event herself, then she also upgrades her other skills that are involved in the event. So this is kind of nice, but not sure. It is nice, definitely. Leveling is strong, so I guess it's really nice. It is nice. Now the negative trait is can be nasty. It says sedentary boredom. If Maria did not participate in expedition or worked at a resource gathering station during the day, she gets +10 stress during the night. So the problem here is that if she's ill or wounded, like if she has an illness or a wound, you probably don't want to bring her to expeditions, and you sometimes don't even want to do expeditions every day, like on drought days where water is rare and people are already fatigued. You might not want to do any expedition, and then you kind of have to put her to a gathering station because plus 10 stress is a lot, to be honest. It also means you can't just rest her. Like even if her fatigue is really high and you might for some reason want to rest her for both parts of the day, that's not really possible because plus 10 stress is just too much. So you just have to be aware of this. You kind of have to plan a little bit around it. And it's annoying if the trigger actually happens because maybe you forgot about it or you couldn't do anything about it. And then in terms of battle, she's a Vanguard class like William. So let's not talk about the class in detail. She has lower health than William, which is not the biggest deal. She still has enough, and she has higher initiative, which is really nice in the early game again, because she might want to cast a Bulwark skill where she moves an ally to the back. And I specifically mentioned that William's low initiative is kind of nasty here, and her high initiative is really a positive. Her power surge is interesting. It's probably one of the most like it's always useful. Basically, she buffs herself with 4 action points and 2 initiative, and she buffs all allies with plus 3 action points. The initial initiative doesn't really matter that much, but the action points are super useful. And the nice thing about this power surge is that it's always useful, right? Like it doesn't matter if you want to buff yourself or if you want to spend more action points on blocking or more action points on dealing damage. It's kind of like always useful. So if you have like 1 or 2 allies you want to bring to an expedition, and the other characters have very situational power surge that can be strong in certain situations but can also be useless in other situations, you might want to bring Maria instead of William because her power surge is always useful. And again, she does want to be on expeditions a little bit more than William. William wants to spend his fatigue mostly on healing and water gathering, and she wants to spend her fatigue basically on expeditions and gathering. And then in terms of grenades, it's the same as William. 1 grenade to target the backline and 1 grenade to move enemies to the front, in my opinion. Okay, next person. Let's talk about Noemi. Noemi arrives together with Maria on day 8, and she has the highest biology value. She also has decent right skills, kind of like logic, willpower, biology, and even medicine. And she has decent exploration. It's overall kind of like an interesting combination. It's not so clear what she wants to do. Exploration means she kind of wants to gather. Let's actually go here to the. So exploration means she kind of wants to gather fruits, but then biology means she kind of wants to work on the botany station, but then physics means she could also work on the polymer station. She has high willpower for fishing, but she doesn't have high perception. It's a little bit all over the place for her, in my opinion. She kind of often works with Polina hand in hand, but just a little bit worse, in my opinion. Her traits are interesting as well. Noemi will never get any sickness from drinking murky water, nor will she from eating. That's kind of nice. Water is always a problem, and you need to spend energy to convert murky water to water. And without upgrades, you also lose some efficiency. Without upgrades, you convert 4 murky water to 3 normal water. So it's nice that she can just drink plain murky water. It's kind of a really nice buff. And she can also eat raw food like fish, for example, without getting sickness. This is also nice, especially in the early game where you might not have enough cooked food. So everybody is eating raw food like raw meat, raw eggs, raw fish. But you just have to keep in mind that she doesn't get the sickness stat increase from the raw food. But every raw food that does increase sickness also has a chance to apply a disease, and she can still get the disease. So basically, later in the game, you can still give her murky water, but you then probably want to give her real cooked food just so she doesn't get a disease. But it is a nice trade, especially in the somewhat early to mid game. Now, little Glutton is probably the nastiest debuff in the game, I would say, one of the nastiest ones. It says during the share food phase of the night, Noemi has minus 40% hunger decrease. And that's a lot. That means if normally a fish would lower hunger by 20, for her it only lowers hunger by 12. So she almost has to eat double food. Especially in the early game, food can be a problem. upgrading creating the fishing camp, building the fishing camp can take some time. You might not even have a good fisher. You have so many other things to do. And then you suddenly get her. Like, I was surprised. Like, I never had a food problem. And then on day 8, I got her and I didn't have a fishing camp because I thought I didn't need it. And then suddenly my food was going through the roof, my food needs, especially because of this trait. This sometimes means that in the early to mid game, you might actually want to give her pills. I don't think I have these pills right now, but there are powders and pills that can lower hunger. And the interesting thing about these powders and pills that lower hunger is that the debuff doesn't apply here, because the debuff only applies at night during the share food phase. But if you give her powder or pills during the day that lower hunger, you still get full efficiency. Can be some way of circumventing this negative trait. In terms of battle, she's a civilian class like like Polina. She has very low initiative, decent health, and her power surge is. I personally don't like it, but maybe I'm not using it correctly. So a power surge ignores effect resistance, so it always lands, and it disarms all enemies. So all enemies need more action points for each attack, and they lose 1 disarm stack per round, right? So the next enemy's turn, they still have 2 disarm stacks, so each attack costs +2 AP. And then the next round, they still have 1 disarm stack, and it lowers their minimum damage and maximum damage. It's kind of strong, but it's somewhat situational. Some enemies can still do 1 nasty attack, which is enough. You don't really prevent it. You also disarm herself, which is kind of annoying, to be honest, because then she herself is a little bit less effective. So I guess it's situationally useful, right? Maybe I'm not using it properly, and maybe you have to play a little bit around it. Really, I guess it's especially useful. Some enemies have attacks that only or sometimes maybe even 1 action point, and then spending like 3 action points instead of 1 is just like a big debuff. So I guess it can be situationally useful. And then for grenades, similar to Polina, give her a grenade so she can maybe give block to allies, and give her a grenade so she can move enemies to the front so she can properly hit them. Okay, So Young. She is the sniper. So first of all, So Young arrives you on day 13. She has really high skills really high physical skills. These physical skills are used for mining and carbon mining, ore mining, even getting energy or getting water. So she's quite decent at that. And then she is decent at exploration and stealth, so you could quite efficiently bring her to certain expeditions. Now perception, let's actually go to perception is a little bit, I mean, she has perception, which increases her yield at fishing, but she has very low willpower, so she would get a lot of fatigue and a lot of stress doing it. Still not sure. And then the botany station, so the perception skill is kind of weirdly placed, but at least the physical skills are nice because they're aligned with each other, right? Like, for example, high strength and high dexterity means she's good at the carbon station. High strength and constitution both mean she's good at the water tank station, etc. So her traits are somewhat bad, somewhat bad. So first, skilled bodyguard. While traveling during an expedition or working with a partner, So Young receives +20 penalties, but her partner receives -40 penalties. Now, first, it does sound nice. So if she works with a partner, the effect is not that bad and not that big, because herself getting +20% more fatigue and stress and her partner receiving -40% it's not the biggest effect overall. In expeditions, it's a little bit more impactful because she only debuffs herself, but she basically buffs 2 partners, so you get a little bit more from this trait. But I tell you later why it's still a little bit problematic, because the existential crisis negative historic trait is really bad. When resting at the shelter during the day, So Young gets +6 stress. That doesn't sound like much, but it's really nasty for several reasons. So first of all, when you get her, let me check one more time. You get her on day 13, and by day 13 you have 7 people and probably only 6 respiratories, so you can only work on 6 camp stations. And then very soon, until day 19, for example, you get 3 more people with Gabriel, Dwayne, and Omar. and you might still only have like 6 or 7 respiratories, so only 6 or 7 people can work. That means 3 or 4 out of 10 people have to rest in the shelter each time for both slots. And then, since her skills are not the most important sometimes, mining is sometimes needed, but not always. Gathering water, William is better, and often like working on computing or doing some crafting, it's often more important. Then you kind of want her to rest, but she can't rest because she gets stressed, and she could get up to 12 stress if she rests both times during the day. And then in addition, if her fatigue is high, you kind of have to rest her because at some point, right, if she gets too much fatigue from tasks, you kind of have to rest her. And then this little like plus 20% penalty, it doesn't sound like much, but it's quite a nasty combination. So basically she herself gets more fatigue than other people, but once she is fatigued, she herself doesn't want to rest because she gets stressed. So kind of what you want to do with her is you kind of just want to ensure that she does something with high resistance to fatigue. So you maybe just put her at a generator, mining station, or carbon station basically every day, and probably even on her own, so she doesn't get additional fatigue. And this way, you never have to basically deal with this existential crisis because it really is a nasty debuff. So she is the first commando class you get. So she has very high initiative and somewhat low health. And the passive of commando classes is when attacking an enemy who is alone in a row, you deal plus 30% damage. That's sadly situational. Sometimes the enemy, you want to, first of all, even have to ensure that one enemy is alone. And at the end of the fight, of course, an enemy is always alone, but the end of the fight is not the dangerous part of the fight. The dangerous part is the early game, the early part of the fight, when still 3 enemies are there. And sometimes all 3 enemies are in the same row, so it doesn't trigger at all. And sometimes the one enemy who is alone in a row and the other 2 enemies are another row, the one enemy who's alone is not the one you want to target down. You want to target down the other enemy who has an ally in the same row. Or sometimes maybe you think about targeting someone down who is alone, but then because the enemies does some reshuffling, and now another enemy is alone. It's just it doesn't really work out. It's just not that strong, I would say. Now her skill, her base attack is really nice. For 2 action points, you do 4 to 7 damage, and you can target the back row and the front row, which is really nice. You yourself deal less damage if you're in the front row, but you never want to be in the front row, so that's a nice base attack. Then her other attack is situational. If you are in the back row, no, sorry, you can use it from anywhere, but you can only target the enemy back row, which is usually okay. Oftentimes you want to target the enemy back row. It does more damage and more critical than the base attack, but it's also costs 1 more action points. So it can be a nice skill, but it's not really that much better than the base attack. So it's kind of like almost a duplicate here. And then her debuff is situational. The problem is that it does lower enemy resistance and their critical chance, which can be nice. It's a little bit overpriced with 3 action points. The thing is, it gives herself haste, but I don't think, I mean, she's a sniper. She wants to be in the back, and she never really wants to change positions. So I don't consider the haste part really strong. Now, in terms of this hit and run, if she's in the front, she can hit the person in the front and move herself back and give herself max plus 1 max damage. Which I guess if you're stuck in the front, it's kind of like a 2-for-1. You deal damage and you move to the back and you buff yourself. But for 3 action points, it can be sometimes you just want to deal damage to the enemy backline, and then even if you're in the front, you don't even use it. You just rather spend 1 action point to move to the backline. So I don't have these skills here activated, but let's not. So I can't talk about them right now. The first ones you activate. But the power surge. So the power surge is situationally strong. It says that she deals 8 to 13 damage to one enemy with 100% critical. So of course it's a high damage single target skill, which is not bad. You want to focus down one enemy at a time, and the 100% crit chance really means she can deal with enemies who have high damage resistance. It's really great to finish off enemies. So it's not super strong. It doesn't really scale, right? Other people can basically buff everyone, the whole team. So and this is only 1 time, 1 damage, but it is situationally strong. In terms of grenades, you probably want to give her a grenade where she can basically give block to herself or an ally, because she doesn't have any other way to do it properly. And then for her, she doesn't really want to have a grenade to put enemies in the front, but she would be one of the, like the commando class is probably the only class. I don't have this grenade right now, but you can create it. It's the grenade where you can move enemies to the back line, which can sometimes be useful if you really want to, because some enemies, for example, if you want to use this skill. But overall, instead of using a grenade to move enemies around, you might also just equip a grenade that ignores damage resistance, because her base skills don't ignore damage resistance. Okay, let's go to the next. Let's go to Gabriel. So Gabriel has the highest crafting, decent scavenging, decent computer, decent medicine, and high dexterity. It's an interesting combination. Let's first talk about the combination of crafting and dexterity. So he has the highest crafting value in the game, so he's the best at working at a forge, has the highest yield there. And he has the second highest dexterity, which gives him basically resistance to fatigue when working at the forge. Now, the forge is a very important place. You need to create wires, you need to create materials, you need to create grenades. There's all kinds of things you need to build at the forge. And the interesting thing is he is by far the best one. And so it says here Gabriel is jack of all trades, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, of course, he can also, with his crafting and computing skills, he can quite effectively work at the workshop, for example, or even work at a doctor from time to time, or with logic, even at a laboratory. But since you want to do so much crafting, and he's by far the best of it, he's kind of like the opposite of jack of all trades. He's just like, how do you call it? He's just a forger, right? Just a guy who just forges all day. And his traits kind of like enhance that position. So he has technician's trick. Once per day, whenever Gabriel completes a craft, a research, or a radar scan, he generates 1 energy. As I just said, he's pretty good at these things. He's good at crafting, he's good at researching, and even good at radar scanning. Not super good at radar scanning, but he's decent. I think for radar scan, you need, what do you need again? I guess he's not that good at radar scanning. Let me just check really quickly. What was radar scanning? No, he is good. Sorry, he is good at radar scanning because you need high scavenging and I think then high computing for fatigue. So he's also good at radar scanning. So he's good at all 3 of these things, and all 3 are very useful. You want to craft, you want to build at the workshop. This also means completes a craft is both a craft at the workshop or the forge. And he generates 1 energy. So once per day, basically, he will once per day generate 1 energy, which is just very nice because you're always low on energy, and getting energy for free is great. Now you have to keep in mind that you yourself have to keep track of the energy. If you, for example, put someone at the energy station, the generator, then the game keeps track of the energy and it tells you. Let's just really do it really quickly. Like if you, for example, put Gabriel at the energy station, then the game will tell you, hey, we will get 2 more energy here. And it keeps it into account whether or not you're low on energy during this part of the day. But if he works, for example, at the forge, the game doesn't keep track of it. It will just say, hey, we lose 1 energy at the forge. And it doesn't take into account that he actually generates one energy as well here. So long story short, what I'm trying to say is you just need to keep track of this yourself, this additional energy. Because otherwise you get the additional energy, and if you don't spend it, it's just wasted resource, which would be kind of sad. Now his negative trait is just strange, just a strange trait. It says ecological convictions. When working at any resource gathering station, Gabriel produces minus 25% yield and has minus 25% impact on natural resources. The minus 25 impact on natural resources is above, right? Normally you always cause attrition to natural resources, they have to recover. And here you cause less attrition, so they have to recover less. But it's not that impactful. Usually it's not a big deal. And then the producer's minus 25% yield is kind of a big deal. It is annoying, but why would you ever gather resources with him, right? He's like the best crafter. He's one of the best guys in the workshop. He's really good at radar scans. He's really good at research, and all these things are extremely useful. You're extremely useful. So I was never in a situation where I thought, oh, I wish I could put Gabriel in like a resource gathering position, but sadly he has this trait. This trait is just non-existent basically for me because it just never applies. In terms of battle, he's a Sapper class. He has higher initiative but lower health than Leo, as far as I know. And his power surge is solid. Power surge is he stuns all enemies, gives them lower effect resistance and lower critical resistance, and all of these debuffs ignore effect resistance, so they always land on enemies. It's kind of like the opposite of Maria. If you look at Maria, she just buffs her and her team with action points, and he does the opposite. He doesn't give his team action points, but he basically removes all action points from the enemies. And it's probably even stronger, right? Because it basically removes all action points from all enemies for one turn. So it's probably stronger than Maria's buff, and it's just always useful, right? Similar to Maria, I said her buff is always useful. Giving yourself action points is always useful. The same with this, like stunning enemies is always useful that they skip their turn. So it's just really strong in my opinion. Like if you want to bring someone who has like a power surge that's always useful, just bring him. And with grenades, similar, give him a grenade that ignores damage resistance, and then maybe a grenade that he can block himself a little bit. Okay, then next person, Dwayne. So Dwayne arrives on day 19 together with Omar. He has his parts are a little bit all over the place. He has the highest perception, so he's decent at fishing. He just has low willpower. He has high strength and dexterity and decent agility, so he can do certain mining and activities or water gathering or energy gathering decent-ish. And he has very high exploration, stealth, scavenging, and even crafting. It's just kind of like basically there's a lot of skills he has high, just the right side is pretty low. The right side is pretty low except for perception, and the left side is pretty high except for constitution. Now, what does it mean? So first of all, let's take a look at his unique traits, and then you can see what it kind of means. So he has mercenary training. During a battle, Dwayne and his partners receive plus 50% experience. That's nice. Experience is really strong. We just later have to talk about his negative trait, but it's definitely nice. And then when working at the hunting camp or fishing camp, Dwayne and his partners receive plus 50% skill. That is also nice. He is one of the best hunters. He has high stealth value, which is needed for hunting. And he has high... What was the other one? Sorry. What was the other one? I think it's... I forgot, sorry. And he has high dexterity. He has high dexterity and high stealth. Both are needed for hunting. He has high perception, which is needed for fishing. He just sadly has low willpower, which is also needed for fishing. But he's overall really good at hunting and fishing, and this even increases his skill. And what's kind of nice about it, oftentimes you want to hunt or fish in the morning so you can later cook the food. And having like one person who's just really good at it is just a nice combination. Now, what's a little bit problematic is like his negative historic trait. Every man for himself. During an expedition or while working with a partner, Dwayne's partners receive plus 20% penalties. It's kind of like the opposite of his positive trait says, you know, do battles, expeditions, and work on camp stations with a partner. But then this negative trait says, well, if you do it, your partner gets additional penalties. It's a little bit annoying. Having said that, often the only penalty is fatigue, and especially somewhere in the mid game, or even for some characters in the early game, fatigue doesn't matter. They might have been rested in the shelter, and then their fatigue might be at 0 anyhow, so the additional fatigue penalty doesn't matter for them. They will rest at night anyhow. So it's just this negative sometimes doesn't matter at all, and you only get the positive. And again, experience is nice, so I guess it's a nice trait. Just hard to evaluate how strong that really is. In terms of battle, he is like so young, the commando class. He has, I think, slightly lower initiative, but slightly higher health. And now his power surge is situationally strong, so he gives himself and one ally stealth and evasion stacks. So evasion is just very strong. It means that an enemy attack is basically just blocked. The only problem is like enemy AoE attacks, because they basically move an evasion counter from everybody who they're attacking. But especially like high damage single target attacks, evasion is really strong against, because you just cancel the attack basically. And then stealth is situationally strong. If you have stealth, the enemy cannot target you, but you lose a stealth counter each time the enemy would hit you with like an AoE, or each time you yourself do a skill. It's situationally extremely strong because it can kind of be abused. Some enemies, especially if they're in the front and you target your ally in the front, your vanguard in the front, these enemies might just stall and don't do anything anymore because they can't target you. They can only target the one in the front, and he has stealth counters. So if they don't have a proper AoE, they might just do nothing, which is a little bit, I guess the AI is a little bit being abused with this. Overall, it's strong. It's kind of annoying that there's always one ally missing. He buffs himself and one ally, and then you still have one ally without a defensive buff, and that is, of course, can be problematic because you didn't increase your damage. You didn't buff yourself with damage. You didn't deal any damage. So if then all the enemies focus down the one ally who didn't get evasion or stealth counters, you just have to be aware of this basically. You want to ensure that the other ally who didn't get these buffs at least has some other buffs from grenades or something maybe. Okay, now let's go to the last one, Omar. Omar arrives with Dwayne on day 19. He has really high mental skills. He has the highest communication, high willpower, high perception, high logic even. And he has a lot of other skills in like the 30-40 range. He has very little, he has only a couple of skills with 20. And he's overall really flexible, which let's talk about his traits. So first of all, he's the best at communicating, at removing afflictions, and he's also decent, for example, at either researching or he's decent at the fishing camp, for example. But what really makes him special is his trait. During an expedition, so his trait is called Great Coordinator. Oh, sorry, So his special trait is called Great Coordinator. During an expedition or while working with a partner, Omar and his partners produce 25% yield. That is surprisingly strong. I didn't really notice how strong this is. First, on expeditions, it's just nice. It doesn't matter if he or his partners use the event, interact with the event. 25% additional yield is kind of a lot. And then if he and his partner produce 25% yield if he works with someone, it's also a lot. A lot of his skills are like in the average range, right? Like for example here, strength 40 for carbon and water tanks is not a lot, but it's together. Like if you use like this, it gets like minus 10% yield because it's not high, but then you add his own plus 25% yield is actually decent. And the fact that he buffs his allies 25% yield, it really adds up. Now you can see it, for example, if you do like, let's say you really want to do research for some reason, or let's say you really want to do some, I think research is a good example, or maybe you want to do some scanning here. So far, Polina only has like 73 scan. I guess there's someone better, but who's better? So let's say Gabriel wants to scan for 99, and then you just add Omar to it. And Omar himself, I mean, his Gabriel with 99 was already a lot. Omar adds 80 himself and buffs Gabriel by 20. It's just a lot. I mean, I don't have to go into it in more detail than that. You see that it's just a lot. So and then he has a negative trait, lack of expertise, which means when working alone, Omar is more likely to trigger an accident. This is annoying. It means you really can't let him work alone, and you have to be aware of this. Now, by the time you have Omar, it's day 19, and you have all 10 people. So probably 1, 2, or even 3 people will rest because you didn't unlock all work slots yet. So if you only have slots where he could work alone, you just don't let him work because getting an accident is annoying. I think it removes condition and it gives additional stress and all this. So it's annoying. You don't want to have this happen. But other than that, he's basically the most flexible one. He's always where he's most needed. If you need to finish something in the workshop, then he helps out. If you want to really build a lot of items in a short amount of time, he helps out. If you need to get ore or carbon for the tribute, he helps out with another partner. So just a very nice character. I would consider him probably the third strongest character after Amelia and William, just because he adds so much flexibility with this trait here. In terms of battle, he's a civilian class like Polina and Noemi. He has kind of like average initiative, a little bit lower to average health. His power surge is very situational. He adds 20 block and 20 effect resistance. 20 block is obviously a lot, but it's only one ally. And like if you give it to one ally, any ally means he can also target himself, I think. But any ally means you still have two people without blocks, and sometimes it's really nice. Sometimes you really have one ally who's getting targeted and debuffed, and then you're happy to give him block. But overall, I don't consider it to be very strong, to be honest. It's just very situational. Even in the situations, even in the situations where it's nice, you would still rather stun the enemies or give yourself action points. In my opinion, it's situational. So that was it, basically. All 10 classes. Again, in my opinion, Amelia, the strongest class, because strength in struggle is just such a useful perk. Then William, really strong in terms of healing, getting rid of afflictions, and gathering water. And then probably just Omar, because he's just so flexible with great coordinator trait. And that was it. I hope you like it. If you disagree or agree, I'm looking forward to your comments. And see you next time. Bye bye.